Hey, thank you, Lou, for signing people in online and upstairs. I see familiar faces from past years of great decisions, so welcome back and welcome to everybody who has joined us both in the room and on Zoom. Thanks besides to Lou, to Scott, and to Bill for all of the technical apparatus and the recording cleanup. This will be posted on the First Church website within a day or two. And the past sessions for this year as we go along and previous years are available. If something catches your interest or you want to see if I really said that. That this year's Great Decisions Workbook is a little different in the structure of the essays and the topics. Now, I've been doing this, it's probably 40 years. And this year has more integration of the topics. The standard way of selecting it is 4 countries or regions and 4 multinational, multi-country issues that are a subject of U.S. foreign policy. This year, my friend at Princeton, John Eikenberry, who was in charge of organizing the book, clearly has structured it in a way that half of the subsequent lessons are keyed to this first one. They address different dimensions of the liberal internationalist strategy followed by the United States for 80 years, and different dimensions of what has changed in the Trump administration. So there is a different integrating logic, but still entirely possible to do whatever individual sections that you do wish. And I suspect that many of you, maybe most, have not purchased the workbook. That's fine, because my guidance to the various lecturers, speakers that we have is they should address the subject as they want to address it. And they need not hew closely to the essays in the workbook. But if you wish to use the workbook or consult it, there are 2 copies available in the First Church library, and everybody is welcome to use those. I normally function as the host. I will function as the host and the speaker tonight, so I will introduce myself. But for people who don't know me, it'll be a short introduction. That I'm a political scientist. I work on comparative politics, international relations. I taught that at Stanford for several years, but I'm also a former U.S. government official. That I had 23 years in Washington, 19 of them in quite senior positions. I reported directly to 3 different secretaries of state and 1 other cabinet secretary in intelligence. So I was 1 level below the president for quite a few years, which gives me a perspective on American policy that is different than most academics, and certainly different than people who have not studied these subjects. This really is a timely occasion, opportunity, state in the development of U.S. relations with the world to expand public understanding, prepare voters for making decisions that will affect what we do beyond next year and beyond the next presidential election. That I'm going to approach this by first describing the origins and key elements of what is called the U.S. liberal international order, or the U.S.-led rules-based international order. That it has the title that it does in the Great Decisions yearbook, I'm quite sure, because again, my friend John Eikenberry is really associated with that as an academic scholar. He coined the terminology. Stole it from Woodrow Wilson. Uh, Basically, it is a generalized approach to international relations that is the opposite of defensive realism, of isolationist, go it alone, great power, that it strives to achieve and explain interconnections, interdependence, and argues that the more interdependent countries are, companies are, NGOs are, individual people are, the easier it is to avoid conflict, the easier it is to find cooperative arrangements. The opposite argument, which is by no means a silly argument and has been the dominant one through most of history, is that individual countries must be as nearly autarkic as possible, not dependent on others, must be strong enough to defend all interests of the country against all adversaries or competitors, and are entitled to use the power that they have to force compliance or cooperation, among others. So one is let's structure the world so that we have mutual incentives to cooperate. And the other is structure the world, which is assumed to be naturally competitive and uncooperative in ways to protect interests in a harsh international environment. Those are the two primary differences. The United States, after World War II, used its incredible amount of military power, economic power, political power. That's the last major country standing after World War II. There was no competition. So we had an opportunity to remake the world, and we did it. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So after describing the base case, which is what the American-led system was like for most of the last 80 years, not all of the last 80 years, talk a little bit about how and why that began to erode. Short explanation is, became a victim of its own success. It aimed to transform the world, and it did. But with a transformed world, the institutions, the approaches, the priorities that had been developed to bring about change were no longer appropriate. And we, and the we here is primarily the United States, failed in efforts to reform, improve, fix the problems in our own system, in our own international system. Then move to what I'll just call Trump's disruptions. The things that President Trump has done in part to deal with the deficiencies in the existing US order. It was not perfect. He didn't break a perfectly functioning system. He adopted fixes to real problems that arguably made the problems worse. And then a little bit at the end before Q&A on what are some of the consequences and implications of the combination of a system of waning efficacy and the specific and deliberate actions of our current government. So let me turn to the origins of the post-World War II US-led order. This is about power and about vision. The two of them linked together in this. It's not just about power and doing what we could do, but a vision of building a different world. We are witnessing, and those of us who are Americans are accelerating the end of an era. the era of unrivaled, not unchallenged, but really unrivaled American influence in international affairs. That the presumption in the United States, the presumption in pretty much every other country in the world, was that we would act in certain ways, that we would adhere to international rules and conventions that we had helped to shape. Unlike most great powers through history, we, by consent, obeyed rules that we'd made. The rules were made for everybody else, but we abided by them most of the time when it was convenient or in our interest to do so. We were not perfect, probably won't ever be, but that made us very different than previous empires. The Roman Empire being the only one that was even remotely comparable. The period of US hegemony, we were first for now 80 years, was the most peaceful and the most prosperous in human history. That there is didn't do too badly, certainly didn't get everything right, but it's a remarkable period of accomplishment and limitations on violence, which will sound strange to many in the room. The prosperity, okay, I get it, I can see it, but we've lived, we came of age at the end of World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam War, the series of wars in the Middle East, the constant turmoil in Africa, conflicts but adding up the violence, the three things that are really notable about it. One is it doesn't begin to approach the magnitude of death and destruction of World Wars I and II. Second is it essentially did not involve any of the major powers. The Soviet Union, the United States, China, the major European powers. Wars were fought by proxies, by and large. And the third is they were not nuclear. That we've lived our entire lives in a nuclear era. One of the major objectives of US policy through this period was avoidance of nuclear war. Using diplomacy, using arms control agreements, using deterrence, using I've got more than you, I've got kind of arms races. But it succeeded. It succeeded in limiting violence between major countries, in avoiding nuclear war, and it made the world much more prosperous. One of the most striking differences between today and 1945, when much of the baseline order was put together, there are approximately 140 more countries today than there were. There were 60 countries at the end of World War II. Elimination of imperialism, elimination of colonial holdings was one of the major objectives of US policy. Not because we were good guys and we were sympathetic to the poor, benighted people being held enslaved in colonies by France or Portugal or Britain or Spain or anybody else. One of the notable things about empires and the colonies that they control, they close them to external commerce. We are a commercial nation. We wanted access to the markets, to the people, to the brain power in countries that had been largely off limits to us. So changing it, but now we have a very different situation. I've used this phrase in some prior years here. When we took the opportunity to remake the world at the end of World War II, only one standing, essentially we could do whatever we want. As a courtesy, I suppose, or a second opinion, we asked the Brits, we think we want to do this. What do you think? And the answer always came back some variant of, If you'll pay for it, go ahead. And that there was not a lot of need for democratic consultation, of coordinating and seeking consensus. That happened in the United Nations, which meant not much happened. The US had a free hand to do things, and it could have made the world very differently than it did. What came out was partly a product of dumb luck. Partly the product of very careful thought on the part of a group, mainly from Wall Street, who have been described in a pretty good book by Erickson, that's now must be 30 years old, called The Wise Men, that in the run-up to World War II and during World War II, the Americans who had the greatest international understanding and involvement were the bankers and other international economic actors based in New York. They understood it far better than anybody else. They were in positions of authority and responsibility in the US government during the war. Many of them were $1 a year people, didn't need the money, but they played key roles. And the determination to learn from the lessons of the interwar period, World War I to World War II, where uncontrolled economic competition was seen to have produced the Great Depression, with deleterious impact everywhere around the world. And 20 years after World War I, 20 years after the Versailles Conference, which was a very punitive peace treaty imposed by the winners on the losers, that restored the colonial empires of most of the European nations. The Ottoman Empire fell, the Austrian Empire fell, the rest of them were preserved. The determination of the original architects here to build an economic arrangement where destructive tariffs would not be possible, where competitive devaluation of currencies for national advantage would not be possible. To create multinational institutions that would bring people together under the United Nations system and eventually in addition to or outside of the United Nations. So there was a place to work on problems that was assumed to be all-inclusive. All countries could be a part of this. Everybody who had a stake in the system, everybody should have a say in it, but also the permanent members of the UN Security Council, United States, Britain, France, China, and Soviet Union, then Russia, that these were the big countries, and they would share responsibility for maintaining the international system. There were components under this that talk about, but I won't go through them. The Bretton Woods agreement that set up the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, for example, aimed at regulating currency, exchange rates, and providing funds for development. There's another piece of how do you avoid the calamitous conditions that led to World War II, the Depression, development, modernization. And the World Bank was established in order to collect funds from the wealthier countries, mostly us, to facilitate and accelerate development, first in the recovering countries, those have been damaged during the war, and then the newly independent countries. of which, so we had ultimately 140 of them in need of developmental assistance. That we were able to do this for a lot of reasons. So in thinking about how we would do it, was how could we use the tremendous advantages that we had? One of those advantages was, of course, economic. Ours was the only economy that wasn't devastated by World War II. In 1947, 1950, the US economy represented 51% of the global economy. Half of the economic product in the entire world was produced in the United States. So using that financial advantage or investment directed at infrastructures, directed at bolstering newly established governments so they could govern effectively, deal with hospital, medical care, other kind of problems, access to the US market. To rebuild industries in Europe, they needed access to the market that had money, which was ours. Access to capital, access to training and education that we, by good luck, as much as anything else, had tremendous advantage. So we built that into a system that said, we will use that to achieve the goals of greater peace and prosperity. We decided to use it asymmetrically. What that meant is across the board in economic considerations, economic fact, we granted opportunities to other countries that we did not seek to have the same kind of opportunities. They had access to our markets, very low tariffs. We didn't ask for that in their countries. They had access to our education systems. We didn't ask for it. Why would we ask for it? Ghana had just been gained independence. Why would anybody go there to study engineering? So there was a certain self-protective logic to it. But it's a logic that 50 years later began to have Americans saying, why are we still doing that? We made our European partners, our Asian partners, pretty wealthy. Why do they still have access that we don't demand reciprocity for? It's a good question, and I'll come back to it. The other is the military capability. We had a nuclear monopoly. That not only were the only country that had used a nuclear, but we the only one that had them until 1949. And we had the tremendous production capacity that was cranked up for World War II. So how could we use that? And it was in part extending a security umbrella to our partners who became our allies. NATO was created in 1949. The critical role of the United States here had many motivations on our part. One is we'll extend our nuclear protection. They don't have to develop nuclear weapons. The British got them very quickly. The French got them very quickly in there. Up until the Kennedy administration, it was assumed that several other European countries were within a couple of years of having nuclear weapons if they want them. So it was another asymmetric approach. We will provide protection, and you don't have to develop nuclear weapons. We will provide protection against conventional attacks. We'll sell you weapons, or we'll give you weapons, or we'll station troops in your country to deter an attack. You can devote more money to modernization, development, to building prosperity. That wasn't entirely altruistic either. A simple fact. Rich people buy more stuff than poor people. Rich countries buy more stuff than poor countries. We were a rich country. We had expensive, high value stuff to sell. We wanted people to buy it. So it was jump starting economies, in part by direct aid, but also in part by sparing them the costs of developing. And it was a third objective in there. Who had we fought in World Wars I and II? The list included Germany, Japan, Italy in World War II, and others. So let's bring them into, we'll provide protection. A couple of years later with NATO and other, we will build an alliance that protects our interests by protecting your interests. But also, they're not building weapons, they're buying ours. They're under our protection. We don't have to worry about them attacking us and our interests again. That it was deal with your potential adversary by holding him very close. Quite sensible strategy. Looked at in retrospect, if you ignore that it worked, it avoided conflict. It led to European integration. It led to the recovery of Japan and Korea. That it looks like, and it's been depicted as, this was really stupid. The Americans giving away all of the advantage, and other people exploited Uncle Sam. They modernized, they developed, they became economic rivals on the backs of American workers. That's a very peculiar interpretation of what happened, but it ignores the logic of the policy set that came out of World War II. That elements of this order that we were building went beyond the we'll open our markets, that kind of asymmetry. It was a world designed to foster what is called free trade, or at least freer trade. World War I to World War II, all kinds of tariff and non-tariff barriers to protect jobs, to protect industries, to protect markets in individual countries, which for those of you who've studied economics is exactly the opposite. What you want to do to reap the benefits of comparative advantage. Country A grows cheap food. Country B makes good machine tools. Country A shouldn't be making machine tools. They should be trading food. That logic, this is basic capitalism 101 in it, that everybody does better if you optimize opportunities to take advantage of comparative advantage. That freeing up trade by reducing or eliminating the barriers that were seen to have produced the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley tariff in the United States was the first of these major, heavy imposition of tariffs that got retaliation from the rest of the developed world and broke everybody's economy. So building organizations to institutionalize freer trade. And then the first one was the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT or GATT. Invented by the Americans. And it existed until 1995 when it was replaced by the World Trade Organization. That because the world had become very much bigger, it was overdue for an update of what it was, and to bring in a lot more. The country had changed the decision-making rules and so forth. But it was to build a system that depended on institutions and rules, not on the whim of individual governments or political leaders. It locked the United States into this system. So one of the objectives was to constrain ourselves, to constrain the possibilities for change with partisan political change or change of one philosophy of government to another. The subjecting of the United States to multinational, multilateral, to international rules was an unnatural act for powerful countries. The emperor makes the rules and applies the rules. The idea that you'd apply the rules to yourself was kind of bizarre historically to many living today. It's also a bizarre concept. Why would we do that? It was done in order to avoid past mistakes and to achieve what was envisioned as a better future. Eikenberry has coined a phrase to describe the United States from this period until very recently. Calls us the liberal Leviathan. Leviathan from Thomas Hobbes' notion of an international order that was, again, his words, nasty, brutish, and short. Dog eat dog. Everybody in constant competition and conflict with one another. The point of Eikenberry's title here is the US had that kind of power, but it chose to use it in a different way, again, for realpolitik reasons, not because they were more morally or religiously motivated than others, or I think that also might have been the case. The order in which the creators of this system, the conceivers of this system, envisioned was all-inclusive. All countries in the world would participate in this more open trade, freer trade, rules-based. No ticket of admission, right? You're a country you want to be in, you're in. In political logic, low entry cost, presumption of high exit cost. Once you get in and you start benefiting, you're going to stay there. The cost to you of leaving goes up very quickly. But it didn't work. Reality intervened in the form of the Cold War. It's this system hammered out 1944 to 1947. By 1947, we're fully into the throes of the bipolar world, US camp, Soviet camp. Stalin would not let his satellite partners participate in things like the World Bank. So by default, what was intended to be a better version of the League of Nations system that actually had the US in a leading role became the primary vehicle for the free world in the Cold War. It wasn't an accident that the countries allied with the United States, Western Europe, Japan, Korea primarily, outperformed the Soviet bloc tremendously. Not immediately. It took a while to begin working its magic, but it worked. And it bound the countries together. World War I and World War II started because of Europeans fighting one another. Part of this approach was the European Iron and Coal Commission. Germany and France, they combined capacities for producing coal, mining coal, and producing steel. You can't hide a military buildup if you've got transparency into producing steel for armor. That was the simple proposition that then expanded into what eventually became the European Union. complemented by NATO. You have to have, if you have a meaningful alliance against a real adversary, which the Soviet Union was, you have to share information. You have to take advantage of comparative advantage opportunities. It's who makes what? What do you store where? Who's in charge of what problems? And it had the desired effect of uniting Europeans in ways so that the cost to any one of them of disengaging would be prohibitively high. And the Brits are in the process of proving that after finally, they were very late to join, also the first to leave. And that's not working out so well. That the competition between the US-led and the Soviet-led camps, of course, didn't include everybody. Most of the newly independent countries didn't want to align with either one. They were going to be non-aligned. Most of them adopted a Stalinist or Soviet-style economic model. Because most of them had been colonies of capitalist imperial powers. So they didn't want democracy and they didn't want a capitalist-based economy. They took the alternative on offer. In the 1950s, that was not a crazy choice because that model was outperforming the US-led free market. But most of them set a pox on both your blocks, and most of them failed to develop very much. Despite World Bank, IMF, foreign aid from both camps in the Cold War, it just didn't work very well because their system was not appropriate to what they wanted to do. The empires, World War I and Versailles preserved the European empires, except Ottoman and Austrian. One of the points of real friction between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt is Roosevelt wouldn't budge. We didn't fight a second war to save your goddamn empire. The British weren't happy. The French weren't happy. The Spanish weren't happy. The Portuguese weren't happy. But the US insistence on granting independence to parts of the empire, which made them available to American commerce and people-to-people diplomacy, it also made them available for the development assistance under IMF and World Bank that are bring them into what was envisioned again as a global. The secret sauce in the US approach was the acceptance of asymmetry. That I don't know, any tough-minded, hard-nosed political realist would say you exploit your power to maximum advantage. You don't fritter it away by granting them more access to whatever it is than you demand in return. That the imperial model was you demand more than you grant. We stood it on its head and did the same with security. The number one objective of American security was the safety and security of the United States, the American people, and American interests. We did that very effectively by accepting disproportionate military costs, by forging alliances, by extending protection to potential adversaries as well as actual friends. And it worked. As long as the Cold War was the number one galvanizing factor, this wasn't very contentious. that the phrase, Robert and I were speaking earlier, the phrase politics stops at the water's edge. It didn't matter, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, that basic support or strong support for this approach was near universal among the political class, the political elite, those who pay attention to international affairs, and by and large to the American public. The American public then now doesn't much care about how you get prosperity and how you get security. They just care that it's there. So this was not contentious through about 60 years, or the 80-year period. I'll come back to that. The granting of unreciprocated opportunities to others has become the core of a narrative about American foreign policy that emerged a decade, 15 years ago, really picked up volume in Trump's first administration, and it's the MAGA charter now, that this was unfair to American people, unfair to American firms. It was stupid because it created strong economic rivals. It was stupid because it created freeloading security partners that were a drain on our military capabilities, overlooking such things as they weren't building weapons of their own. Where did they get weapons? They bought them from us. What did that do to the United States? It lowered the unit cost of tanks and airplanes and ships and everything else. So it actually lowered the cost of U.S. defense expenditures in there. But depicting the policies that I've just described, this liberal international order, as foolhardy and counterproductive and unfair and intolerable, became much more pronounced because the system stopped working as effectively as it had. Because, as I said at the beginning, because of its success, it had changed the world. That when the Cold War ended in December of 1991, took a decade to become convinced that it was really over, that Dracula wasn't going to pull the stake from his heart, reemerge in some fashion. There was a short-lived attempt to reinvigorate the United Nations system as it was conceived in the 1940s. Universal participation, we no longer have to contend with the automatic veto. If we wanted, they'd veto. If they wanted, we'd veto. That was a chance to make this work, most prominently during the Clinton administration, but didn't work. It turns out seeking consensus with 193 players, good luck. Good luck. It just was too cumbersome. But also, one of the secular changes along the way was the admission of China into the free world in 1979. That it's a longer story, but when the U.S. saw an opportunity to lock China into the U.S. side in the then still never-ending Cold War with the Soviet Union, we took it. Extended to China essentially all of the opportunities that we gave to our partners and allies in the free world without demanding that they change their political system. Again, nobody envisioned that the Soviet Union was going to break up in a little over a decade. China made great success of the opportunities that it had by abandoning its own previous strategy of development and adopting the one that the Japanese had used. export-led growth through participation in the rules-based system. They didn't want to do that. We wanted them to do it. You put them in the rules-based system, they're now constrained too. Their future prosperity depends on working within the existing system, which they did sort of. They're so big. The economy's so big, there's so many people that China not playing fully by the rules was a lot more of a problem than Haiti or Ghana not playing by the rules. And that comes along at the point at which the computer revolution makes extended production and supply chains feasible. So lots of stuff left the United States to go take advantage of cheap transportation and cheap labor, and it had a deleterious effect. Here, the end of the Cold War meant you could transport sensitive stuff long distances without fear that it's going to be intercepted or blown up. And it changed the world in there. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the give or take 140 countries that had not signed on to the US idea said, oh, look what China did. Maybe we want to get in on this game. By 2000, it's the only game in town. And everybody wants in. The US already sees pretty clearly it's time for change. We're propping up something that is politically unsustainable, economically unnecessary, and militarily uncertain here. So we got to remake the system. You can imagine the response of, give or take, every other country in the world. The ones who have been in the free world say, oh, no, not yet. This is a pretty good deal. We'd like the free defense and the ability to modernize our economic system in there. The newly entered in countries said, we just figured it out. We now understand this system. Don't go changing the rules on us. We don't have a deep bench of expertise. We've figured it out. So the initial efforts of a series of administrations in the United States to reform the system all failed, beginning with George H.W. Bush to Clinton, to George W. Bush, Obama, tried different things. None of them worked in there. Nobody had a perfect idea, replacement. We certainly didn't have the unlimited power to impose our will that we had. The loss of jobs, the integration of the global economy, globalism is the terminology, the demise of a real peer military adversary as a focusing point, and lots of other things came in that by 2010, thereabouts, support in the United States for the system that we have was getting pretty shaky. It was compounded by the failure of successive American governments to do things that should have been done, could have been done probably, to compensate for the changes in the world. Retraining for people that once had factory jobs, the factory jobs that went to lower labor cost countries. There are plenty of jobs, but we had a mismatched education system, adult education and retraining system, healthcare system that made it too expensive to produce stuff in the United States and the like. All of this is a background to what became the MAGA movement. And a lot of it is also in the Democratic Party, that the conviction that what we did in the past, even if it wasn't wrong, is no longer appropriate. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, whether intentionally or unintentionally. The way the Trump administration has approached it is not to make another attempt at system reform. It's upend the game board. Break everything and start again from scratch. I think it's probably not the optimal way to do things, but that's the approach. I'll get to why the problems are real, and the approach may be problematic in a second. But the U.S. approach, trade is one, and then next week is about trade and tariffs. The World Trade Organization taking on the need to write rules for things that were not covered previously. Chief among them, agricultural goods and services. Two things in which the United States is the best in the world. Right? They're not covered by the earlier agreements. Developing world blocked the efforts. The so-called Doha round, because that's where the first meeting was, to start negotiations to make rules for things that are where the U.S. has the comparative advantage. That's 1991. Those negotiations continue to this day with zero success. So why would we keep trying to reform something that is just not possible? The Indians were the primary blockers of the Doha round in there. That U.S. politicians wildly oversold the advantages of free trade. Free trade is great for companies, great for shareholders in companies, great for pension funds and the like. It's not so clearly great for individuals. It creates different jobs, not necessarily more jobs. And if you're not ready for the different jobs, you don't have a job, or your job doesn't pay as well as you expected it would. As China joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, it's so big, and its failure to abide by the rules at the margins, usually not so blatant, but had a disproportionate effect, and its impact on parts of the United States was pretty great. Well, free trade, everybody benefits from freer trade, comparative advantage. The benefits are broad. The pain is local. The local factory that closes, the main street shops that close because the factory isn't there, the schools that no longer have enough revenue to pay teachers, all of that kind of thing plays out locally. And it did across the United States. And so we get this widening of income disparities between the real beneficiaries who bent the K-shaped curve, the rich that benefit disproportionately and the poor who are hurt disproportionately. The failure to change the global trading and tariff system led the United States and other countries to look for sub-universal arrangements, regional agreements. Three worth noting: the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, initiated by Brunei, Singapore, and Peru, I think. We weren't interested when we started because the first countries involved didn't account for 5% of U.S. trade. For reasons having to do with Japanese domestic politics, the Prime Minister of Japan, Abe, decided to lock in domestic reforms in Japan through participation in the trade, the TPP agreement. The Americans said, hello, we've been trying for 50 years to get the Japanese to let's lock this in. So we became excited about it. We were excited about it until the election of 2016. Trump was against it. And for reasons that dismay me, they don't entirely confuse me, but Hillary Clinton turned on her agreement. What had been the gold standard, according to her, became unacceptable to the United States. And Trump pulled out of this agreement in his first administration. Contrary to what I think many in the MAGA movement had expected, the other countries that participated in this, years-long, laborious negotiating process went ahead without us. Instead of 12 countries, it's the TPP 11, and the Japanese run it. And Japan was opened up, lots of other markets. Vietnam was a big one opened up. We weren't there to take advantage of it. So niches that were actually pretty wide wedges that were negotiated in effect to advantage the United States, they're now sewn up by others. We'd have to dislodge. It was a comparable set of negotiations for US and Europe, which broke down in the same way. Negotiation between the EU and South America. All of these agreements that were subnational, sub-universal, were beginning to be held. And now, these things that the Trump admits, the world's not waiting for us to have another election or to wake up and realize we might have made some mistakes here. They're going ahead without us. And we've got to play catch up very cleverly. Similar things happened with respect to defense, going back to Richard Nixon. The Nixon doctrine was aimed at getting our allies to pick up more responsibility for local defense. Carter tried the same thing. Obama tried something similar. Other countries look at our $1 trillion defense budget and said, you nuts? We're not taking on that kind of, even as a proportionate, that's nuts. Find other ways to manage the danger of conflict. That exacerbated things like what percentage of GDP is being applied to defense. And things that were feasible for a long time. Japan, by policy, not by anything more, by policy, for decades would not devote more than 1% of GDP to defense. We devote 4.5%, 5% to D. But 1% of Japan's GDP, who's the third biggest defense budget in the world? Because they have big GDP. Efforts to get other people to do things we wanted when we'd given up the leverage and we'd lost soft power. This is a phrase that my late friend at Harvard, Joe Nye, coined. This is the power to attract people to you. They want to be like you, as opposed to coerce them to do things. We, for 70 years, were a bright, shining city on a hill, the model that other people wanted to be, because we obeyed by the rules that we made, because we did offer extended protection to countries. People were inclined to go along with us, to support us, thank you, to support us on the things we wanted to do. Not anymore. Now they're more inclined to work around us, to remain free of entanglements that might come about from being too closely identified with us. But the rules-based order that we built and we did most to sustain for decades has become community property. That much of the rest of the world, certainly the entire developed world, depends on this system. They may not have liked all aspects of American leadership or domination of it. The advantage we have because the US dollar is the trade currency for the world, for example. We don't have to hedge against appreciation in signing contracts and the like. But they couldn't think of anybody they'd rather have leading this system and stabilizing it than us. We're now into, is this a system that can sustain itself without leadership of somebody? And if the somebody isn't the United States, who might it be? Nobody is stepping up to saying, we're prepared to bear the costs and the burdens. So the world is not in the John F. Kennedy, pay any price, bear any burden to sustain global stability. Turning inward, seeking protection by minimizing dependence, that all of the elements of creating mutual interdependence, shared stake across borders, across portions of the economy and firms and educational institutions, all of what looked like and was a tremendous advantage, particularly to the US, has now become seen as a gaping vulnerability. Focus on immigration isn't so much a part of this, that the US has benefited enormously from brain drain in other countries. We have gotten the best and the brightest from everywhere around the world. They come here, they get trained. A lot of them get trained in things they can't do if they went home. And they kind of like it here. So they stay. It's not an accident that 50% of the entrepreneurs who start new ventures in the country, not just in the Valley, are immigrants. That more than half of the American Nobel Prize winners are immigrants. That our ability to attract and retain and the opportunities we create thereby for collaboration back with whatever country have been tossed out the window. That we don't want you, you're dangerous kind of rhetoric. So among the very specific kind of things, we did great under this model because we could draw upon 100% of the brain power around the world. America First is now, we do just fine with our 4.5%, which is what the American population is of the international community. That we, the United States, made bad policy decisions, Vietnam War, Iraq War, at the top of the list here. But nobody else was at the same time maintaining the system we're trying to do it. Now we seem to be attempting, the administration, to return to the pre-1945, where the powerful make the rules and the less powerful obey them. Bullying instead of attraction. The use of tariffs for political affairs, punishing Brazil with exorbitant tariffs because their judicial system imprisoned the former president who was a friend of Donald Trump. This is so disruptive that the only sensible response of other countries is to walk away from us and not want to be ensnared in what we are doing. That the expression we used to use when talking about other countries is, nobody wants a photo op standing next to a political dead man. And that countries are not rushing to conclude the deals, the special arrangements, because they've got interest and stakes in every other country in the world. And once it was a great achievement to be uh, a non-NATO favored ally of the United States. Boy, that was special. And that got scored points at home. It scored points in the neighborhood, international. Now, being the best friend of the United States, I don't think so. And let me close a little bit on other consequences and implications. That the value of what Nye called soft power, we would perceive this, sort of a big clumsy puppy dog in many respects. The Americans would flop around. Eventually, they'd do the right thing, as Churchill is said to have remarked. The Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. But the willingness to try different things, to try and improve, that was so much of a part of who we were. Now, we look like a bully. Do it because I say so. Silliness like we'll conquer Greenland, retake the Panama Canal, it just alienates everybody. And it spills over into every dimension of people, corporate, non-governmental organizational interaction. It turns relationships into zero-sum calculations, as opposed to win-win, where the amount that you win doesn't have to be equal. As long as it's better for both, it's a good idea. They're going into, no, unless I get more out of this deal than you're going to get out of it, we're not going to do it. And anybody that knows anything about trade one, companies and countries don't trade unless both sides think it's in their advantage to do so. Not to my advantage, it doesn't happen. So we are launched on a trajectory that can't work, in my judgment. That there are parts of this, like ensuring the security of supply lines and key products. And where it showed up, and all of us who are COVID vets, we didn't make masks. We didn't make a whole series of protective gear for COVID. And okay, we could figure out how to do that. But there are more important things. And for decades, we accepted the vulnerability of dependence on cobalt or manganese or whatever coming in from other countries. Now we have to, everything has to be, and that's the logic that led to imperial colonies. I need a source of oil, so I will conquer this piece of the Middle East, France, the UK. And we're not conquering it in the same way, but looking to get government deals that lock the US government into the profitability of an African mining endeavor. It's just not going to be well received. And because others don't want it, and we no longer have absolute power in the world, we're not going to succeed at doing this. I ran over what I had hoped, but I want to leave plenty of time for questions. And some people may think 20 minutes is not plenty of time, but let me stop there. I'll take some questions in the room and then go to Lou, who field questions from those on Zoom. We have a microphone for people in the room.
We don't have any questions on Zoom right now, so go ahead, Tom.
Okay, who is it? I can't see. Oh, Peter.
Well, I was taken by how you said that when there was a lot of trade from U.S. weapons and military, that prices all went down. But I'm curious where you were talking about the NATO as places where we would defend, the neighbors that we've fought with. And then you get to Italy and they produce weapons and they're very Catholic. And I'm worried about the Catholic Church personally, because I think the influence even in our local area is feed everybody, get all the extra food that the US produces and puts out there that it doesn't sell, and bring it to the people. And even the best of the best, when it's the day old, take it to the, and I'm just thinking there's a whole bunch of people that are expected to be working for their bread. And these proposals for these huge developments in this area
Mhm.
are going to depend on a lot of demolition, a lot of, because it's not in. And I'm just puzzled by how the whole idea of Catholicism is sort of underground right now and working with the older people now. And I think it's kind of trying to take possession of sort of the American grace of aging American life.
Yeah. Peter expressed concern, I'm repeating it for those on Zoom, about in particular the role of the Catholic Church, but also shifting of attention to meeting basic human needs. My own is, I welcome anybody that can contribute in this space. The last couple of popes that have focused on humanity. I welcome that. You can't have too many players. Organize religion more broadly. I mean, in response to Burke's sermon this morning about reasons for optimism in the current situation, the popular reaction to things that we are doing, this is wrong. That's God in the world, right? That the U.S. aid programs justifiably criticized, and anybody's aid, food aid, because it gets in the way of development. Farmers need a fair price for their crops. They can't compete with free. When USAID unloads boatloads of grain, you're trying to grow wheat in Ethiopia. You can't compete with that. We collectively didn't figure out a way to make that work, make it more harmonized. Eager to feed people, hungry people need food, but unless you're going to feed them every year, you need an economy that can grow food. And I think what I generalized from the example you did is lots of groups, including the Catholic Church, but lots and lots of others, moving into spaces that they see as vacated by the American retreat. That things that we are not doing that affect healthcare, that affect education, that affect gender equality, that protect people against trafficking across international boundaries and the like. The recognition that is necessary to do things that the Americans were just doing. We'd step into it, having sat in lots of international meetings over the years, where an issue would be raised, and everybody looked to the end of the table where the Americans were sitting. What's your solution? And being Americans, we always had 5 solutions that unconstrained by feasibility lots of the time. But we toss stuff out there all the time. And because we were assumed that if one of these things actually, that we'd pay for it. And we would pay for it because we could pay for it. Did it produce optimal solutions? No, not always, maybe not often. But it addressed the problems. And now we're seen as, we took our football and went home and told the rest of the world, you figure out how to manage these problems without us. I think they'll figure them out. That the last line I had written on my outline, if I'd gotten all the way down there, it was, is the U.S. any longer what Madeleine Albright called the indispensable nation. Many, and certainly the administration, thinks we are indispensable and that everybody else will come around because they can't do without us. I think we were so successful over the last 8 decades in building a system that others can pick up bits and pieces of it and do it without us. There are good things and bad things about that. But I went on too long with one question.
Was it accurate to say that the American Navy had a high goal of anti-piracy in the heyday of the America since World War II, and preventing cargo from being hijacked? And are they still doing that? And if so, what might be the consequences of them stopping?
Did the question, thank you, Eric. The question is, did the U.S. Navy have a priority goal of stopping piracy and intercepting transit? The answer, it is one of the missions of the U.S. Navy, which is deployed globally, that the anti-piracy focus of that has been greatest off the Horn of Africa, the Somali pirates hijacking ships, and in Southeast Asia, the Straits of Malacca, in part because such a high percentage of global trade goes through those two routes. And most navies are pretty small. Things like a lot of the shipping that goes past the Philippines. The Philippine Navy has, last time I checked, no boats. Coast Guard has some that we gave them. That modern ships and keeping them afloat is really expensive out there. Now, the Chinese have got more ships than the U.S. Navy does. They're engaged with us jointly in anti-pirate activities off of the coast of Africa because they've got an interest in oil shipments going through. But it's a good illustration of a public service that the United States, in protecting our own trading interests and the activities of American companies, has provided lots of general benefit. Some of this stuff we're not going to pull back from because we're still going to want to protect the ships taking American products to wherever they are going, not in convoy fashion, but just the Navy's just over the horizon here. But others are not going to be so confident that we'll be there tomorrow. So they'll look for other ways. And one of the other ways, and here, the Chinese in the Red Sea with the Yemeni, they simply said, we'll pay you a big bribe. Leave our ships alone. Okay. That gives them more opportunity to go after other ships. It's a solution, but it's a different kind of solution than the public service one that we saw benefit in providing, and we saw benefit in the incremental costs above what we would be spending for ourselves anyway. This gentleman in the back, and then let me take one more here, Lou.
Okay,
You want to talk?
Yes.
Okay, so just before Trump 2.0 started, there was a lot of coverage in the news about Colby and other people and their specific policy views. And even if you didn't agree with them, they actually had policy views. But during Trump 2.0, it appears that we've just fallen into this personalist style where a bunch of billionaires go out and do deals. Was that a real change, or was it just an error in reporting at the very beginning? They didn't realize what was coming.
Well, part of it, the question is, was there real change from what the Trump rhetoric before second inauguration about reaching out, getting in lots of views, and deciding what has actually been the case, which has been highly personalized or a wealthy elite, that I think you'd have to say it was rhetoric. And not because of what we know today, but because of what we saw in his first administration, that he did not behave as a builder, as a consensus builder. It was a my way or the highway approach to doing things. And the second administration is staffed with go along to get along people, as opposed to folks willing to say, this is a bad idea, boss. I was tempted to give an example of my own, but I think I won't. That's something I said to Colin Powell. I worked directly for Powell, and he came. I happened to be up talking to his chief of staff. He came back from the White House, and he told me, I just came back. I told the president what you told me this morning. I said, right, boss. He said, no, I did. I told him what you said because I thought he ought to hear it. And I won't actually restate it, but I cleaned up your colorful language a little bit. But I thought he needed to hear that. That was the normal way of doing things. One of the roles of the career professionals is to say, well, you weren't here when we tried this before. And here are the problems. And you may want to poke that beehive again, but let me tell you what happens when you do that. And that seems to have been dissipated substantially. Lou, you got some questions?
Yes, Mickey, go ahead with your question, please.
Yes, I was wondering how you feel our domestic scene, which has changed so dramatically, is affecting foreign policy, and not just Trump, but our ossification, our resistance to change. Maybe you don't want to comment on that, but I
do want to comment because and did everybody hear that in the room? That what is happening domestically in the United States matters in the international arena. And let me frame that by saying for decades, going back before World War II, there were things that other countries, people in other countries didn't like about the United States behavior, conduct. Think about Vietnam, right? Government policy bad. American government bad. American people, they're all right. Hearts in the right place, heads are in the right place. In a decade since, where democracy has spread much more broadly around, people understand it. So now what they understand is we elected Donald Trump twice. What we are putting on display on our TV every night of ICE in communities and the ICE sort of police are equipped better weaponry and stuff than most militaries have. That the idea that our government and our policies don't really represent the best of what American society is not credible anymore. He is us. We are seen as what we are doing. And the impetus to insulate their economies, their education system, their healthcare systems, banking systems from us is very much, in my view, influenced by what they see in our domestic situation and the anti-foreign aspect of it, which our tolerance, our inclusivity for religion, for race, for gender, all this stuff that was a huge asset has now become hypocritical rhetoric. And The good news is I think we can actually turn this around. The bad news is it's like falling off a cliff. You go down to the bottom pretty fast. It's a long time to climb back up. And that's what we've got to do because the world understands us better than they did before. Got another one, Lou?
No, that was the only question online.
Okay.
Can you give us your hot take on Xi's purge of his military command?
Xi Jinping's purges of the military command. I don't know. I mean, I don't understand that. People, I've done 60 years of working on with China, but
So
the
Tom,
military.
what was the
Question
question?
was,
Tom?
could I give a quick take on Xi Jinping's purging of military commanders? That it could be many things. I think most of the commentary that I've read in our press is silly. That it is attributing motivations that if you know anything about Chinese system, Chinese culture, then they just don't make sense. But that doesn't mean I've got an answer. The public stated is corruption. There's plenty of money in the Chinese defense establishment. There's plenty of opportunities to be corrupt, and there's plenty of evidence that those who've made it to the top of this system did it by being pretty corrupt. How have they been corrupt? Which weapon systems are problematic? How does this spill over into perceived readiness or not to do something with respect to Taiwan? How much of it is an effort by all the rest of the pieces of the Chinese system to get a larger voice on military issues? Because the decision to mix it up with the Japanese Navy off of the Senkaku, the Diaoyu Island, disputed islands, this affects economy. This affects trade. This affects training opportunities in Japanese universities. So you've got other interests that, to the extent I understand the system, have been disadvantaged because the military in China does not report to the government. It reports to the Chinese Communist Party. And these top-level removals are from party positions. So if you're Ministry of Education, you can see budget competition and you want to have a voice. I think there may be something like that going on, but I don't know if the answer that everybody ought to be given to these questions.
Tom, we have one last question online. Go ahead, Nancy.
Yes, if in the past, the phrase that we could use for the role of the US was leader of the free world, is there any kind of a phrase that is operative in Washington now, or that there's at least aspirational of what they're heading to us being? What is Washington attempting to move us toward?
That's a superb question. I assume everybody heard it in the room.
Rephrase it.
That if the US was once the leader of the free world, that's what we aspired to and what we did. Is there a successor operative phrase that describes what the MAGA team want? I think the closest it comes is America First. That decisions about is what's good for America, good for the world. That's not being is what's good for America and screw the rest of the world. That seems to be the framing of it. I don't think that can last in our society, our culture. But it seems to me that's the one I would have to fall back on today, unfortunately. Also, unfortunately, maybe for some of you, we've reached the magic end of the first great decisions session
Mhm.
that I hope it has been worth a portion of your Sunday evening. For those of you who come back next week, you're going to get me again by the accident. The way in which I do these, when I find people to do individual topics, I have to work around their schedules. And I am the utility infielder that picks up ones where I don't have, and they fill in holes. So the tariff one will be next week because that's where but it also happens to be the logically next installment of the larger story that I think the Great Decision series is trying to tell this time. Any final words from you, Lou?
Yes, so thank you very much, Tom. Again, a very interesting and challenging discussion. Lots of great background. Really appreciate it very much. And just as a reminder to everybody, those of you who successfully got onto Zoom tonight, you're going to need to do the same procedure next week. And we hope that you will be back with us. As we mentioned, we are recording this session, and we'll be able to get it processed and posted within the next 2 or 3 days. So with that, I will stop the recording and wish all of you a very good evening, and thanks for being with us.